Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back and thank you for staying with us at the Lamfalussy Lectures Conference. The 10th edition of the Lamfalussy Lectures Conference provides a special occasion to dedicate the event to the memory of Baron Lamfalussy, highlighting what his legacy could teach the central bankers of the next 100 years. The vision of the father of the euro and his groundbreaking work has shaped the foundation of modern European financial systems, making his thoughts as relevant today as ever. His emphasis on financial stability and integration as key pillars of economic growth continues to offer valuable guidance. Moreover, his forward-looking approach to addressing systemic risks remains a cornerstone for policymakers navigating today's complex global economy. Therefore, we continue our program with the final session, a dynamic roundtable discussion with previous Lámfalussy awardees, who are about to discuss Alexandre Lamfalussy's legacy and its messages for the 21st century. The panel will be moderated by Mr. György Szapáry, Chief Advisor to the Governor of the Magyar Nemzeti Bank, whose vast knowledge of Lamfalussy's work and legacy will provide excellent guidance for the discussion. Mr. Szapáry, welcome to the stage. And let me also introduce our distinguished speakers, Mr. Jacques de Larosière, former Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund and former Governor of the Banque de France, who is joining us online. Mr. Robert Holzmann, Governor of Oesterreichische Nationalbank. Ms. Andréa Maechler, Deputy General Manager of the Bank for International Settlements. Mr. Ivo Maes, Professor and Robert Triffin Chair at Université Catholique de Louvain and former Senior Advisor to the National Bank of Belgium. Welcome. Mr. Ewald Nowotny, President of the Austrian Society for European Politics and former Governor of Oesterreichische Nationalbank. And last but not least, Mr. Boris Vujicic, Governor of the Croatian National Bank. Welcome, dear panelists. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I welcome this distinguished panel, the former recipients of the Lámfalussy Award. And we will talk about Lamfalussy today and his thoughts and what his contribution was. And I am probably the person in this room who has known Lamfalussy the longest, because he was the director of my PhD thesis at the Université Catholique de Louvain in the early 60s. But I am not going to talk about that, but many interactions with him since then. However, I would like each of the speakers a little bit tell about the personal interactions that you had with him. And then I put on the table a few thoughts that you can comment on. One is that Lamfalussy expressed a concern about the single currency and the independent fiscal policies. He already expressed that concern very early. And I will have a question about that. How do you see this, and whether because of you had the independent, you had the common currency, you had to have a rule-based fiscal policy, and that was the Stability and Growth Pact. Went through several reforms, and that was the latest one, SGP. So I would be interested in knowing what do you think about that. But so I said originally, I said that you have 8 minutes, but let's make it shorter, and then that way we will have several rounds, and I will put on the table the different questions that you have. So Jacques, I would like you to ask to please comment.
Good afternoon. I am Jacques de Larosière, and I'm very honored to participate in this Lámfalussy conference. I have been asked two questions. The first question is, how would Lámfalussy react to the fiscal issue in Europe and to the future of the Eurozone? Now, it's always difficult to make speak people who have passed away, but I was very close to Lamfalussy, who expressed concern about the contradiction of a monetary union where members are free to choose as they wish whatever macroeconomic policy they want. The danger of this dichotomy is that heterogeneity in economic policies will increase over time and endanger the stability of the monetary union itself. Now, in order to avoid such negative developments, the union has developed a set of harmonizing policies to be followed by member states. It's basically the Growth and Stability Pact. Unfortunately, a few years after the monetary union was enacted in 2000, large member states like Germany and France decided to dismiss the fiscal prescriptions that were imposed on them. The result of this behavior was contagious. If large members felt they could avoid the rules, smaller countries would follow suit, which happened eventually. Lámfalussy understood why such behaviors were a threat to the union itself. Monetary policy is, in a heterogeneous environment, going to finish in inconsistent averages. For example, the average interest rate of the ECB will never be appropriate for each member. It will be too loose for the southern inflationary members and too strict for the northern virtuous countries. So the system, if it is not controlled by an efficient mechanism of macroeconomic harmonization, will slide gradually into larger and larger inconsistencies. This can last for some time. So inflationary countries can borrow to survive, but that deteriorates more and more their fiscal position. Eventually, this no bailout game will end. The beginning of the Stability Pact, not more than 3% of GDP in terms of deficit, budgetary deficit, and not more than 60% for public debt vis-à-vis GDP, prescriptions have not been respected by a large number of the members of the Union. This situation was a puzzle for Lamfalussy. This situation has not been repaired by the recent version of the pact. The new format has undoubtedly the advantage of building a bilateral relationship between each member and the Commission. But like the previous pact, it has no teeth. In its recent version, it goes even against its own purpose. If a country's deficit is worse than the 3% ceiling related to GDP, it will not be obliged to reduce its public debt by 1% a year, which is the normal rule for the countries running a large deficit, precisely because its deficit is higher than the 3% norm. All in all, a monetary union must be built on a sufficient amount of spirit of cooperation. And we have to admit that this spirit is lacking and that the Commission is not exercising its disciplinarian role. In other words, economic policy heterogeneity is in large part a manifestation of the weakness of the EU governance. Lamfalussy passed away before the most recent deviations that I am referring to. I believe he would be distressed considering present conditions. Of course, lax monetary policy facilitated the financing of this inconsistent system. The ECB could buy most of the issuance of government bonds, but all this has ended in inflation. The second question is, can financial innovation carry risk? Lamfalussy was one of the most acute and lucid observers of financial markets. In a way, this was his specialty. But he was far from believing that financial innovation and freedom of capital was without risks. Innovations undoubtedly encourage a better allocation of resources, thereby helping to reduce risk through all financial institutions, thus blurring the traditional distinctions between banks and non-banks. As a result, the authorities responsible for defending monetary stability will be less well equipped to prevent banking crises, since markets now embrace banks and non-banks, whereas issuing institutions normally use banks alone as a transmission channel. In this respect, the development of interest rate and currency swaps is reducing the so-called transparency of banking operations, which are tending to become more and more off-balance sheets. Similarly, the abusive use of securitization to get rid of, to penetrate and weaken financial markets. More generally, the use of variable rate bank loans transfers to debtors the risk of rising interest rates, which usually occur after a period of low or even negative real interest rate. As the 1982 crisis has shown, the rise in interest rates foreseen by variable rate contracts only precipitated the debt crisis. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Jacques. You knew very well Lamfalussy, I know. And between parentheses, Jacques was my boss for many years at the International Monetary Fund. Thank you very much for your thoughtful comments.
Thank you, it was a pleasure.
And let me also mentioned that all the participants in this panel wrote something, a few thoughts about Lamfalussy, which has been published here, and then you can find it out on the, at the entrance. So now I turn, Robert, to you. So begin your thoughts.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, first of all, for organizing this panel. I think it's a great idea to have an afternoon after lunch, a little bit of wine, to have something which is hopefully relaxing, and the idea of starting with personal reflection, it's a great one compared to you, but also to Mr. de Larosière. I have unfortunately no personal connection with him. I could have had when I was teaching in Germany in Saarbrücken, was nearby, but it didn't happen. I invited him, it didn't work out yet. But on the other hand, I have a lifelong connection with his topics, because my first thesis theme was, and this was in 1972, also some time ago. I cannot compete with you, but it's still ago. It was simulating European monetary integration. And simulating meant for me computer simulation, which was unknown. So computer simulation and European monetary integration. At this time, Austria was not even member of any European unit there. So I didn't get very far intellectually, had nobody to talk to. And when I went to the Austrian National Bank to get financial support, it was refused. That's the reason I wanted once to have a job, in order to get my revenge there. Okay. But the topic, how to say, occupied me until today. But my knowledge of simulation had applied later on for pensions, but pensions in Hungary brought me then back to the topic, because I was on the team negotiating the first standby in 1989-1990, and there I had to dig into communist statistics, trying to relate it to what we know from the Fiscal Affairs Department statistic. So I got to know data, flow data, and stock data pretty well. And if you recall, there was the issue that debt was hidden, and I was one of those who helped to induct it. So out of this, I started to understand that flows and stock sounds easy in a model, but in reality, it's difficult to dig up. And this is something which we saw then again when the discussion came about, also à la Larosière, how best to measure it. And we already had him talking about how difficult it is and how much the approaches don't really work out. But on the other hand, the changes which have taken place over recent times, I think, have brought us closer together in order to measure it better. I think it's important, in most recent one, that one looks at the debt profile. It's also important to look at the same time also at the flow profile to make it, but it will never be the easy part of it. Press the button, is it sustainable, not sustainable? But what we have seen recently in Austria is that when the question come up, shall we have the slow road or the quick road? Government decided for the quick road because they were afraid that they would be punished by the financial sector. And they had my staff estimating if we do the slow road and if the markups, how much would they be? It'll come out, it doesn't need to be a lot in order to make the slow road much more expensive than the other one. So that's an important part. And I would like, how to say, to come back on something with regards to credibility. I think whatever you do on the fiscal side, it needs to be credible, and also for everybody. And here, this critique I have to get into the market is who were the first two countries that defaulted on the fiscal criteria in Europe? If you have two big countries in Europe of doing it, you cannot but evade that smaller countries will also do the same thing if and as they don't comply with the rules. So credibility is important, and also credibility of sanction if it doesn't work out. I stop there.
Thank you very much. Andréa, you're representing the BIS, also a recipient of the Lámfalussy Award, the institution as such, a recipient. And as you know, Lamfalussy was first head of the research department and then managing director of the BIS, and knew all the governors at the meetings, these two monthly meetings. And so please tell me, did you know Lamfalussy or not? And what are your thoughts about it?
Thank you very much. So first of all, thank you for the invitation also to this absolutely wonderful centennial anniversary of the central bank. So thank you for honoring Alexandre Lamfalussy and for honoring thereby the BIS. And because he was really a great personality that inherently reflects the international financial cooperation among central banks at its best. So to come to your question, no, I did not get to interact personally with him. I knew about the Lámfalussy process later on, but I never got to interact. And boy, did I have wished I had. So what I did is I spoke to our historian. I walked around, of course, the corridors of the BIS. I spoke to some staff who have known him, who have worked with him as close advisors. And I can assure you that Alexandre Lamfalussy continues to be a whisperer in our corridors. Why am I saying this? So first, the one thing I have learned is that if you really wanted to please him, you should say his name in Hungarian, which is Lámfalussy Sándor, which I think is beautiful. So why am I saying he continues to be a really important spirit, if I can use that word nowadays? But so he was economic advisor at the BIS. I want to say just two dates, from 1975 to 1985, and then he became our general manager from 85 to 93. Can you go back? We heard a little bit about it this morning. What extraordinary years those were, right? This was right after the collapse of the Bretton Woods regime of fixed exchange rate. So huge exchange rate volatility, something very new for all central banks, and something that John Lipsky, you mentioned it very nicely, because we tend to forget there was no international capital movement until then. So suddenly the world opens up, exchange rate go haywire, very hard for central banks, and you get capital flows that are really ramping up extremely fast. I will come back to this. This is something that for Sándor Lamfalussy was really very scary. So I think if there's one thing that differentiates the BIS then from the BIS today, I think the BIS today is a little bit more trying to facilitate and embrace innovation. I think fairly he was really looking at this innovation, which was capital flows, in a very much more cautious way. The other thing was the first oil shock, followed by a very deep recession. And as we also heard this morning, central banks did not really manage to control the inflation at that point. Right? In the 70s, inflation stayed high. They really were faced with stagflation. Then came the second oil shock. I'm going very fast, right? But second oil shock. Finally, central banks did manage to bring down inflation. Right? There was the Volcker shock that really brought up the interest rate. There was also, I believe, very strong communication from central banks. And I think all of this comes to this thinking about how do you think about monetary policy in this new world. So I think it's this new world, this monetary world, really in big transition, together with innovation in the financial sector, with very rapid capital flows. So what are Lamfalussy's real tremendous contribution to the world of central banking? So one, we've heard it, and it was very interesting to hear it coming up this morning, because we're now faced with a similar issue. After many years, if you remember, the world at that time in the 50s and the 60s was coming up still of a very much a Keynesian management, demand management thinking. Suddenly they had to think, what about supply shocks? Just like today. How do central banks fulfill their mandates in the midst of very strong supply shocks? And I think that's where he really, and his main point is still something we had to relearn in the last few years. Monetary policy cannot be the only game in town. And I think that was a very important message that he continued to give all of us. The other one was, again, rules versus discretion. And it came from this point, so how do you do monetary policy? If you remember, it came out of a monetarist system where central banks were trying to really regulate and control the demand of money in the system, the money supply. Well, that no longer works in innovation. We know it today, right? So that was really, and his thinking was really what ultimately helped lead to what most central banks have, which is the inflation targeting regime, which is you have to have a very strong framework. You have to have very strong communication. You have to have a strong institution, but ultimately you also need, as a central bank, discretion. Limited discretion, right? But it couldn't be a mechanic answer to the shocks. And I think this was a big step away. It was a big, well, I would say, big step forward for the central banks, and which really turned into the inflation targeting regime, and with the focus on inflation targeting and anchored inflation where we are now. And the third thing I want to say comes back to that fear of financial instability, which ultimately he had to live through. And so he really became the father of what ultimately, and also was continued very strongly at the BIS, macroprudential policy. We're not the only one, and central banks, but this idea that financial stability requires more than an individual institution perspective. You need to look at the global perspective. You need to think about what does innovation mean. Are countries able to deal with it on a national level as well as global level? And what Lamfalussy did, if you remember, in the 80s were all these debt crises around the world. It started, there was one even in Hungary, but then in Latin America and in Asia. And the idea is, what can central banks do together? How can they provide liquidity? When do they have to step in? And of course, ultimately, it is the government of each individual country that has to step in. So these are really lessons that on which we have continued to build. These lessons haven't really changed. On the principle, of course, how they are applied, it changes. And the very last point I want to say, because that is also something where he is a modern man. Lamfalussy was a banker, he was a professor, and he was a central banker. And I think it's this versatility to which we're coming back. The BIS does Innovation Hub. We need tech people. We need finance people. We need close relationship, of course, to the financial market, of course, to the academia. But only if we become this versatile mindset can we really try to address some of the problems. And I think this, again, is a spirit that Lamfalussy Chandor really brought to all of us. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Andrea. No, Ivo is one person who has known maybe the most, or worked at least on the most of Lamfalussy's contribution. And actually, he edited a book on Lamfalussy with all the articles in it back in 1917. So Ivo, you knew him well. You studied his contribution well. Give us your thoughts about him.
Many thanks, and many thanks also for the kind invitation of the Hungarian Central Bank. It's a pleasure to be back in Budapest. And also would like to thank very much the Hungarian Central Bank for really keeping up this tradition, for keeping the legacy of Lamfalussy. I think they're providing a European and global public good with these conferences. On terms of personal interaction with Alexandre Lamfalussy, well, I'm a Belgian, and I've known Lamfalussy conferences since I was a student at university. But I really got to know him in 2004 with the Robert Triffin Foundation, of which he was the president. And also when I got the Triffin Chair at Université Catholique de Louvain. And Alexandre Lamfalussy would come for a conference. And the theme was central banks and financial stability. And this was the core of Lamfalussy. Financial fragility. And what is the solution? Of at least one of the solutions, key part of the solution, the central bank should be involved in the prudential supervision of the systemic institutions. This was his thesis in 2004. It was realized in 2014. So there very much this vision. And when he came, he would have all the time of the world to answer all the questions of the students, also when they were in Hungarian. And then in around 2008, I would have started my biographical work on Lamfalussy with a lot of articles and 2 important books. The one which you showed and for which we cooperated, which was a really great pleasure to cooperate with you, and the Hungarian Central Bank. And also in 2013, a book of interviews, which I did together with Christophe Lamfalussy, a son of Lamfalussy, and Sabine Peters, which is a type of autobiography. Now, how to characterize Lamfalussy? And in a certain sense, Lamfalussy is a very introvert man. He speaks softly, but he has strong convictions, and really strong convictions for which he will fight. And very much the 2 strong convictions are European federalism and central bank independence. So these are the 2 strong convictions. But at the same time, he is very alert. He is close to the empirical reality, seeing on what is going on in the world. And it makes, for me, one of the main moments was in 2008. 2008, we are the financial crisis, Lehman Brothers, which collapsed, distrust in the financial markets, the banks which do not want to give loans to one another, which interbank market collapse. So there is there really the specter of a financial meltdown. And there was a meeting of the European League for Economic Cooperation discussing this. And then you had the intervention of Lamfalussy, the orthodox central banker. What we need now is a fiscal stimulus. And there he was the first person I heard saying we need a fiscal stimulus in this type of situation because monetary policy is powerless, more or less. And this fiscal stimulus, it had to be temporary and targeted. That is very clear in his view. But this type of alertness to the situation, a great economic culture, and seeing what is the situation, what is the most appropriate policy response in this type of situation. And this combination, strong convictions, European federalism, central bank independence, but alertness and seeing what is the situation, how do we have to react.
Thank you very much. Edward.
Again, thank you very much for the invitation to this very interesting conference. My meeting with Mr. Lamfalussy was only a very indirect one because when I was a young economist, I was assistant to Professor Rothschild, and he had sent me to a conference in Brussels. And there I heard Mr. Lamfalussy giving a presentation. And what kind of fascinated me at this occasion was to see, at this time, I think he still was with the Banque de Bruxelles, and to find, to see a practical banker who is also a high-class intellectual was something, I have to say, I had never met in Austria before. So it was really kind of an inspiration. If you look, with regard to the questions that you put to us, I think one has to be quite clear that the Stability Pact as such has not been successful. There has been some changes last year, but the real important element nowadays is the role of the international capital markets, and especially international bond markets. And this is not a surprise. This is something that had been quite obvious also at the very early stages to the founders of the EU and to the major politicians in the EU. There's this famous saying by Andréa, by Mrs. Merkel, who said there is a need for an economic policy adjusted democracy. A compatible democracy, which is, of course, a bit of a difficult wording, but which, to a certain extent, is an illustration that markets do play a limiting and controlling role, and this even more nowadays. We have seen, it was mentioned this morning in the UK, that the Prime Minister lost her job due to pressure of the markets. In Italy, the expression le spread has become a household word. And it is, of course, something that is also experiencing now the US Fed. Because what they see is that they can influence short-term rates, but they cannot influence in a more substantial way long-term rates. And as we all know, the long-term rates are the most important ones for economic development. And these long-term rates are determined by market expectations. So that we have, and we all know there's a long discussion about what are the connections between short-term and long-term rates, but basically this is where markets come in. And for Europe, this will become all the more important because the ECB this year has stopped buying any new bonds. So therefore, that means the central bank will not be present in the market. And this means the role of the markets is increasing. By the way, therefore, also the role of rating agencies, which might be a good thing or a problematic thing, because it's not always easy to explain the readings of rating agencies. But basically, I think the message is, yes, there is the stability pact as such should not be seen as something as a kind of a forcing instrument of the EU Commission against those poor national states, but it is rather to be seen as a guidance how to act in an economy where markets do play a big role. And I think that the sooner we learn this, the better. And this is, of course, also something where central banks, I think, have a role to explain these connections, also to the public. And so again, as Ivo has just mentioned, this is, of course, a field where there is a, let's say, not a cooperation, but a joint mission of central banks and fiscal policy. So to really be aware of what it means. And of course, in some cases, it is also a matter of, let's say, cooperation. And there are quotes, I also know them from Lamfalussy, about the need of such kind of a cooperation, but of course always a cooperation of equals. And that means, otherwise it would not be a cooperation, that it has to be with an independent central bank. So I think in that sense we return to the issues that we have discussed this morning.
Thank you very much. I will turn to Boris. So you should know that Boris is one of the main supporters of a yearly conference in Dubrovnik, which has already gained also international attention. So Boris, please tell me. Oh, sorry. So go ahead and tell what you think about this, the Lamfalussy and the Lamfalussy process.
Well, thank you, György. First, to congratulate on the 100 years of the central bank, and second on the 10 years of this conference. As you mentioned, the Dubrovnik conference, I'm sure once you reach the 10th anniversary, you've built an institution which will outlive you, which is good. That's how it should be. So congratulations on both. On Lamfalussy, I met him once only, and I was a young economist. Actually, I just became head of the research department in my early 30s, and then I went to Frankfurt to the EMI that he was heading, and we had a long 2-hour meeting. That was the only time I saw him. And it was very interesting. I always remembered it because I came there to learn about how the euro will be set up, how the institution will work, how the ECB will operate, envisaging that at some point we will join that institution. And then he was very, very, very kind, patient, eloquent. So I asked him, okay, so how it's going to work? As he explained to me, there will be all these governors of the central banks that will come to Frankfurt. We will have monetary policy meetings. We will decide on the interest rates. Then they will go back home. I said, so how will you execute the monetary policy? Oh, they will execute it in their own central banks. We're not going to be like Fed, having the Bank of New York. So he was explaining me all the details of how it's going to operate. And then I remember I told him, but I know such a central bank. It used to be a central bank of Yugoslavia. It operated in pretty much the same way. You had, governors coming from the republics, meeting in Belgrade, deciding on interest rates, going back home, executing monetary policy in their home market. There was also supervision, which was regional, but also some in the Belgrade. The big difference was, of course, that the ECB was independent, as opposed to the central bank in Yugoslavia. These were different circumstances. And the other difference was, because he was telling me, of course, this thing about the peril possible for the monetary union, which would come if we don't have harmonized fiscal policies. I said, okay, but I was drawing the parallels, I know, in this conversation with him. I said, well, in Yugoslavia, we had kind of a confederalist fiscal policy. So there was a central budget, but also there were local republic budgets. So there was a local parliament, there was a local government, there was a local Ministry of Finance, and they had their own revenues. And then we kind of concluded, I remember, that one should also not forget about not only fiscal, but other structural policies, as Jacques has mentioned before. Because if you don't have also broadly aligned structural policies, you will end up with very different economic outcomes in the different parts of the Union, which will then beg for the fiscal transfers, which we had in Yugoslavia. And that is a danger, then, again, for the monetary union. So that was a discussion in 1998 that I had with Sándor Lamfalussy. And I always remember that, and it always came back to me in later years when we were getting ready to get into the Eurozone. Now, that then brings me to the question of the fiscal versus monetary, where I think I partially answered that question. If you have 88% debt to GDP for an area which is a second most important currency area in the world, it's not a problem. But if you have part of the union with 160 and the other one with 30 debt to GDP, that is the problem. So it's not the average. It's the fact that you have such a large divergence. So you have to create something that will make the fiscal situation converge over time rather than diverge. Because if it diverges, as I saw in the past happening, then it's a very dangerous situation because it becomes politically unacceptable. At some point, if you say, okay, 88% is fine for the Eurozone, and it is fine. You know, you're financing yourself in your own currency. But then somebody who has 30% will say, if you agree, you know, that central bank will in some way control the interest rates or the spreads, so why don't we have then 100% debt to GDP? Well, then we're going to increase it, distribute it to the population, and we're also going to have high debt to GDP. And that's a political issue that is very difficult to handle if you don't create something that brings the fiscal convergence. And we have to always remember that. It's not something that we should ever forget, because at some point it can become too dangerous for the Union. Now, whether the new fiscal rules, that's also part of your question, if I understand, are those that will do that, I would say no rules will do it if people don't believe it. As you said, you know, as Jacques has said, you know, if the two main countries have broke the fiscal rules as they were set up immediately, well, it's not the rules, it's the politicians that run countries who have to understand what I was saying and believe in it and then do things properly. If that happens, it's always going to be fine.
Thank you very much. I would change the subject, but let me just briefly comment on the SGP. I lived through 3 reforms of the SGP, 3 reforms. Each time they made it more flexible. Each time more and more countries, practically all the countries, did not respect the rules of the SGP. The excessive deficit procedures were all over the place. France, Germany, Spain, etc. The new one is even more flexible, and we don't know how the countries will react. My personal opinion is that it depends a lot on the culture, on the political environment in which the country has lived for many, many years. Germany had a very low deficit most of the time. So did Austria. Italy had a very big deficits. Now again, France has big deficits. So, you know, it has to be, at the end, it has to be something that the governments decide that they want to do. Rules are there, but, you know, if a number, say a deficit number, becomes a policy tool, then it loses its indicative purpose, because people think that temporarily they can exceed it. So I am not very optimistic about the reform of the SGP. I rather would like to see that the governments take fiscal discipline seriously. Another subject on which I would like to ask the question, do you think that we are close to the capital market union? Because the capital market within the EU is still very fragmented. And I would ask Boris, because you are sitting at the ECB, what are your thoughts about it?
Well, I would say that us in the ECB, and I'm looking also at Robert, we are very supportive of the Capital Markets Union. And basically, vast majority of the people in Europe you talk to, they're all supporters of the CMU. But when it comes to doing things, to have CMU, then you hear very different opinions, and I've been part of these discussions now for too many years. And in my view, you know, I've been sitting with the ministers of justice, with the ministers of economy, talking about their own fantastic bankruptcy systems, insolvency systems, which should not be changed, but everybody should align with them. It seems to me that it's so difficult to do it the way we have tried to do it, that if we want to have it, we have to find an alternative way rather than trying to twist the arms of 27 double ministers to change their legislations, which have been there for, I don't know, 50 years or more. Now, I would love if that would be possible, but I'm skeptical about it after all these years, and maybe we should simply try and create a 28 system. We have institutions. We have the parliament. We have the government. We have the court, European court. We have the supervisors. So we have all the institutions in place. So if you try to create the 28, but then again you need to have a political consensus that this is the fastest and easiest way. And that's also very difficult because some countries are against it. I know when you mentioned this idea, but I would think if you really want to have it, that's the probably more promising way than try to do the same thing that we have been trying to do for the last 20 years or 15 years without too much success.
Robert, so what do you think, what are the main hurdles to establish a CMU?
Boris already made one important part there. We can't do it of harmonization. So 28th regime is an important part, Peter, for bankruptcy and others. But on the other side, I think here is very optimistic, because what we need is not only, how to say, to institutions, we have a stock flow problem, because if you look at the big institutions, the US, if you take this as example here, there they have 50 years of growth in pension funds through a system we saw 1973. You're coming into my road of a speciality, how to say, they did it there. And we don't have the same type of capital. Because what we do at the moment, we send very flow capital to the US. There, the capital is then transformed into equity capital in the imported bed and then get exploited. In order to change this around, we need to have major change at the level how our capital is raised, and this happens through pension funds, because they're the ones that allow the long-term capital to be done. This is something which takes a couple of decades, doesn't happen from today for tomorrow, so having a capital market soon is an illusion. And in addition to that, what it is, if you have a capital market, you need capitalists. And at the moment, we have in Europe not this kind of capitalism than the US has. So we have major challenges in front of us to do it. Currently, there's some hype about it, but I'm afraid the hype soon will slow down and will come to some technically feasible, but it won't happen fast.
Jacques, let me turn to you. What do you think about the Capital Market Union? How do you see that it will evolve, or should we forget about it altogether?
I think we are making a mistake in the sense that we are trying to make a capital market union through harmonization of regulations. And I think this is a mistake, because we will not achieve a perfect harmonization of all our rules, including the ones that are the most difficult to change, the bankruptcy rules. We will not manage that. And I think my friend who has just spoken said exactly what I would like to stress. You need capitalists to make it work. And I see in France, for instance, a country that I study very precisely. In France, the problem is that we don't have the projects. We don't have the basic projects that would nourish a capitalism with equity, with taking risks. We don't have that. We have been losing most of our industry in France. A third of our industry has disappeared. And the companies that can nourish the reality of a market are no more there. So, and I would add something that has not been said, which is that monetary policy in Europe always manages to have interest rates, central bank interest rates, lower than in the United States, at least 100 basis points. And of course, money leaves the European Union towards the dollar zone. You can't have a capital market if you have this difference in interest rates. You have to have a remuneration, and you have to have equity. You have to have people who are decided to take risks. So the real reforms are not harmonizing rules. They are, one, restoring the sense of risk. And if you want to do that, you have to have pension funds, because pension funds is the only way to introduce in a population that doesn't want to take risks, to introduce some element of risk taking. So I think really we need, in front of a social system that is pay as you go, and it doesn't work because of the demographic impossibility that it is showing. You need to have another pillar, which is the pension funds. You need to have higher returns, and you need to have securitization. If you have these three things, pension funds, securitization, and higher interest rates, you're going to be okay. And but those 3 points are never touched upon. We believe that harmonizing rules is going to work. I think it's a profound mistake.
Thank you, Jacques. Let me turn the table and speak about something that, and ask you your comments on something that is that has been on the table and discussed a lot. And that, what do you think of the inflationary outlook for the future? Because what was special about the energy prices increases because of the war, it was a surprise inflation, sudden increase, a level increase. If you have a level increase in the inflation in the prices, then so that it becomes an inflation, you have to accommodate it. Now the difference is that you look at inflation expectations. People think in levels. We economists, we think in rates. So people think the central bank says that inflation is going to be 4 or 5%. The people remember that it was energy prices, treble, the fruit prices are much higher, etc. So their expectation is still based on the past. There is a, how would I say, there is a catch-up inflationary expectation adjusted to the past. Now inflation is generally low, but people still think that the level, they still tend to think in level. So under those circumstances, what do you think, what is, at least in the Western world, what is the inflation outlook? What should central bank worry about? So let me ask Andréa first.
Thank you very much. I think that's a really core question to central banks around the world, and as you say, particularly in advanced economies, because emerging markets economies often reacted slightly differently. So first, before going into the danger, I do want to say it is quite remarkable what has been done, right? So the central banks, we can argue whether they reacted fast or slow, but they did react in a determining way, and it did bring inflation down. On top of it, we still expect to be soft landing, which is remarkable. I do hope we don't get the wrong lessons out of it, that that's necessarily what's going to happen next time around. The question is now going forward. So first, we still have what many of us have coined a little bit that last mile, right? We're still not necessarily everywhere at where all central banks would like to be to feel comfortable. So there's one is bring it down. What you point out is a very important point, is we think in terms of inflation rate, and this is what we're seeing in the people's perception is the inflation expectation may not are anchored, but the price level is significantly higher. And what does it mean? So not for our mandates, because there is clarity, but it is true, I think, broadly, I'll have to check the number, but it's around, in the advanced economies, since 2022, there's been a 22% increase in price level on average. That's tremendous. And so how do we go about it? So that's just something to be aware of when we, again, communication is very important, right? To communicate what does it mean to bring inflation down, and what does it mean that in real world, prices are higher, so that means you need a real wage catch-up, and the economy still has to go through quite a bit of transition. The other thing, to come to your point, what does it mean going forward? And I think that's a very difficult question, as it always is. Marcelo, you say you're not very good at being a futurist. The point is, we're very likely to enter a world with more shocks, more regular shocks, including supply shocks. Demand shock we know how to deal with. But a mix of supply and demand, whether it's energy, whether it's tariffs, whether it's technology, whether it's demographic, which are in many countries starting to really bind from a working age population perspective. So we're likely to have regular supply shocks. So we need to be much better at identifying supply shock. What do they mean? How do they work through the system? And of course, there is a close interaction between the supply shocks. When do they become demand shocks? What it means, I think, from a inflation targeting perspective is central banks need to be very aware at what point, at the BIS we coined it, moving from a low inflation to a high inflation regime, because now people have seen inflation can be back. So you're much more likely with a shock that people might actually demand higher wages, that the baker, that the manufacturing, that the retailer much more quickly increases the prices. So the second round effect can be much faster biting. So I think for central banks, it means also using technology. How can we do real-time understanding the dynamics of prices? Is AI changing the way prices are being formed? What are the second round effects? So all of this, I think, there's a lot of work for central banks to work together, and based on each country's experience, what does it mean going forward?
Howard, what are you thinking? What is the outlook for the inflation in the Western world, and what should central bank worry about?
Well, I think we have to be aware that this period of the great moderation was really an exceptional period. Both before we had higher rates of inflation and after we will have higher rates of inflation. Because it was exceptional, because there was the huge impact of rapid globalization. There was, as has been said before, this issue of the savings glut. All this is not existing any longer. So therefore, I think we will have to we as central bankers will have to fight very hard to keep it at 2%, which would be a huge success. And I think one could stabilize inflation expectations at such a level. It's not only a matter of the volume of this inflation, it's also about, as you said, too much flexibility of the inflation. So to stabilize expectations. And we have to be aware that, of course, we are moving into an economy where services will get an ever greater part. And we know from many economic studies that, of course, services have usually higher rates of inflation because productivity gains are much lower. That might change, perhaps, with artificial intelligence, but nobody knows. And as one has to say, up to now, technological changes have not resulted in very many success stories with regard to inflation. So I think we have to see that inflation pressures will persist, and I think we would be doing a very good job if we could keep it at, let's say, a long-term average of 2%.
Ivo?
Yeah. Let's say I also have no crystal ball. But two remarks. Firstly, the economic situation in the United States and Europe is very different. And that in terms of economic, and here I'm talking before, in 2024, before a new president came, so leaving aside the new policies, you had a much stronger US economy, both in terms of economic growth and inflation. Well, in Europe, inflation in the European Union, much lower and lower economic growth performance. So there, the challenges are different, which also means, well, how has monetary policy to react in the euro area and the United States? So there might be more divergence. The second issue is, well, we have had the increase in inflation, and then let's say I was a student in the 1970s, and so I was expecting, okay, now we will get a new inflation shock. And I was personally less surprised by the increase in inflation, which, given the different shocks which had come, COVID, the war with the effect on energy prices, expensive fiscal, very accommodative monetary policies, structural changes like deglobalization, and but then the decline was very strong. And so why was this decline so strong? And I see three reasons. Firstly, energy prices declined, so there was a positive supply shock. Secondly, expectations were well anchored. So that's the positive effect of the decades of price stability, central bank independence. Inflations were well anchored. The third thing, and that's for me a bit the mystery, is that wages have increased less than prices. And so that, speaking for the euro area, there have been declines in real wages at the time of tight labor markets. And that for me, I'm not a specialist of the labor market, that for me is a bit the mystery.
Thank you very much. Robert, before I give you the floor, let me introduce you with a thought. Late 22, early 23, I talked to senior management of Fed, European Central Bank, IMF, and we talked about inflation. I talked to them about inflation. He says it's temporary. It's temporary. Everybody said it's temporary. And I came to the conclusion, I started to discuss that I don't think it's temporary. It's temporary because it's a price level increase and it will come down, you know, the thing that we just discussed. And then it struck me that there is among major central bankers a group thinking. And my question is here, there are 3 central bankers. Would you agree with this? Because you meet very often. and you somehow convince each other, and then it's very difficult to get out of that group. Is that so, Robert?
Thanks a lot. Good question. I'm not so sure I'm so much a group thinker, in the sense that early on, I didn't believe in the group thinking when it came to the question of inflation, because I looked not in our projections, I looked in the national markets, China, energy, and saw inflation coming from there. And I raised it, but there was little appreciation, and it was ignored. So I think inflation was there, and my staff, you can look it up at the Austrian National Bank website, looked even more carefully than I did, and looked to how Putin has already early on increased the prices before we really came aware of it. So the price increases, the energy prices happened already there. And energy is always a driver of inflation, because energy, you need essentially all sectors there. Part of it, the first part of it. The second part of it, with regards to inflation, yes, group thinking. I think we have a problem with, or have we had so far a problem with our economic models, because they always showed, okay, look at it, we will coming down, we're coming down, and actually it did not come down the way we thought. There was a mistake with regards to how to assess it, but one thing, and BIS Valio wrote a nice paper in February 23 and 24 about how inflation has happened through money supply. So our unconventional monetary policy was quite likely to some extent the driver of the inflation. So we had this part as well. Yes, of course, how to say, there's a group thinking there, because we have our little economic units, but then you have the big ECB there with many thousand people there, and then it's difficult to get, how to say, the capacity to say it in such a sophisticated way they can do it. Yes, it's in every group there's group thinking, because otherwise you get marginalized, but I think there should be much more new thinking, and it's not your question, but they still answered this way, because the question before, what worries me more, is less, how to say, that inflation, your inflation. My worry is that if and as our star doesn't move, it remains low, we will have to go back to unconventional monetary policy. And if this is the case, we come into a yo-yo. How to say, we two asset purchases, and then how to say the asset purchases create inflation, and then we try to kill it, and then how to say we increase the interest rate again. But what happens in the meantime is that our budget, our balance sheet plays yo-yo, and it will perhaps never become positive again. That's the part which bothers me much more than whether we have some inflation biases there. We have to fully work on getting productivity up. It's good for our star. We have to perhaps do something about demography, and we have to do something thinking about what are the alternatives to our conventional monetary policy. This is something which worries me much more than whether inflation has stabilized or not. That to say, this is for me of second order.
Yeah, let me share another thought with you, and then what are your comments on it? You know, people now for the models, and the Fed, the Bank of England, the European Central Bank said, we have to redo our models. And the models are to see what the inflation expectations are, and what the neutral interest rates are, but it's all projections, all projections. So sometimes you have to use common sense, I think. And for instance, as we discussed the inflation expectations, maybe the CPI is not the best the best indicator of inflation expectations. If people look back and look at levels, then maybe the CPI is not the right indicator of inflation expectation. So what I would like to ask you, because do you think that you were at one point infected, if I can use that word, by group thinking? And do you think that leaders of the European Central Bank, for instance, have the courage to say something different? Or you have to say what?
Well, of course, every institution has a bit of group thinking, but I really think one should have a fair view. We should not forget, this was a supply side inflation of a dimension that we have never experienced before. And it was a number of issues that came upon. So maybe one could have reacted a bit earlier. But basically, I think that it is a success story that the central banks have managed a soft landing after such big external shocks. So I would not be too defensive in that case. If you allow me, because I think we are going close to the end, there is one issue that I would like to use this to bring to the attention of this group. What makes me very nervous now is the field of banking regulation. And as you know, this is a field that was very close to Lamfalussy, and we have still what we call the Lamfalussy process of banking regulation. And there we have a development where we had a time of deregulation. This was this high time of neoliberal thinking. And there is many of us have the feeling that this was a major cause for the financial crisis of the 2008-2009. Then we had a period of re-regulation with Basel Accords and so on. And what I see now coming from the US with the Trump administration, and perhaps motivated by the huge financial support that Trump got from the financial industry, that we see maybe a new wave of deregulation. And that would have effects on Europe, of course, too. And this, in the line of also Lamfalussy, I think is very, very dangerous, because the costs of a banking crisis are huge. And therefore, I think if we should take something home from also this meeting, it should be a warning against all these issues of deregulation that are coming around. There might have been some examples where regulation has been too burdensome. Some corrections are always possible. But the basic idea that the banking industry is an industry that has to be tightly regulated, I think this is something that is very important, and this is a message we should stick to.
Thank you, Boris. What are your thoughts?
Well, first on the inflation, I just going back quickly to that issue, group thinking or not? Not really. I mean, it's true that the largest central banks were in a temporary camp, but there was also a permanent camp. And you had a lot of central banks that, particularly in the emerging market countries, which started to increase this time around interest rates much sooner, thinking they were in a permanent camp, and the major ones kind of caught up a bit later. So I wouldn't say it's like all central bankers think the same, all economists think the same, all people in the ECB think the same. No, we had the discussion with people in the ECB. There were people there also in the permanent temporary camp. So I wouldn't say there is always some, as Eld says, group thinking, but not entirely that everybody thinks the same and all central bankers will come out and say the same things. And there, people also forget that it all started before the energy shock. No, it started in 2021 already, and it was clear that the inflation rate is picking up already then, and for different reasons. You know, and these reasons are, it's not a supply shock of the type of the energy crisis, but it was something that the monetary and fiscal policies were dealing with, creating the unprecedented fiscal stimulus and unprecedented creation of the money by the central banks, no? Through the quantitative easing. No? Let's not forget, once we got there, people were saying, well, we're getting into the uncharted territory. And that amount of monetary stimulus never happened before. So what you could have expected later on is that the demand will bounce back much faster than the supply, because it was fueled by the fiscal support, which was fueled by the monetary stimulus. So that's a classical, I would say, a scenario for higher inflation, which was happening before Putin invaded Ukraine. But going to the regulation, I agree with that. We're in a world where we have to be very careful with these new initiatives, which are in a way abrupt and maybe not fully thought through. These things, whoever has went through a financial crisis, through a banking crisis, I went through few of different sorts, knows how dangerous and how costly that can be. What's going to happen, I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. But we're seeing a really strong push in terms of not only deregulation, but of something that, for example, crypto industry always wanted to have, regulated. We want to be regulated. We want to come to it's the helpful regulation.
Helpful regulation.
So where that leads us is a topic for another panel of at least an hour and a half. But you can have all kinds of things happening there depending who gets exposed to whom. I mean, we spend so much time talking about the MBFIs and how to handle the exposures of banks to the MBFIs and non-regulators, regulatory arbitrage. Now, if on top of that you get all the crypto industry, it's becoming...
There is a renewed talk and discussion in the major central bank community how to communicate, okay? And so I talk about that we should communicate differently. Let me share my thought about it. If a central bank just says very precisely that the growth will be this much, the inflation will be this much, and it doesn't happen as it did in the past, then expectations are even going to change. So it's fine if a central bank says, my goal is 2%, my goal is 3%, and I'll try to achieve this. But if you are too precise in your projection, you disappoint the people, and then you are again in that trap that expectations are different. Now, you remember that famous saying of Greenspan, he said to journalists, he said, if you understood what I said, you misunderstood me. So what are your thoughts about communication? We have a few more minutes. Robert.
You're perfectly right to mention Greenspan. I think a central banker has to have some precision, but too much precision is self-defeating. So you can talk about expectations, you can talk that, but saying this will happen, it's definitely wrong of it. I think that's my way. I communicate direct, open, things there, but in a way which allows you, how to say, not to conduct you, saying, okay, you said this will be the inflation rate, we can do it. I still have to go back to the regulation because I think we have three issues there. Very quickly, because I think it's important. Number one is, yes, there's a danger that regulatory elements will take place, mostly at the level of capital requirements. And this is definitely something, how to say, which of course the buddies of the president would like to have because it's cheaper. And this is something will come. But in addition to that, there are elements, and here I fully agree with Edward, but the elements there where we introduced regulation where I don't think central banks are the ones the best to deal with the economic issue like financial markets and environment and climate there. I think there you have the pretense of knowledge, as Hayek would say, and this is definitely where, how to say, we have to get out because it gives regulation a bad reputation. And then you have the things where we have too little regulation, like private credit. First of all, we have too little understanding what is happening, and once we have it, we have to regulate it to some way. And I think these three things there, we need more, we need less, and we need things, how to say, perhaps unchanged. This would be my assessment of regulation, but she's much better knowledgeable about that.
So we don't have much more time. So very quickly, anybody wants to comment here on the communication of central banks?
So
Yes,
maybe I can say one thing,
Andréa.
which has been really interesting, and Jackson Hole picked it up, and it's about action versus words. So communication matters, and we know the media landscape has changed. With whom do you communicate? For central banks, it's about trust. And you're right, it is about keeping sufficient room for maneuver. The other thing is, ultimately, it is also about action. Right? So it's this, right, like ultimately, it's about you have to show that you're determined to do what needs to be done, which is what central banks really did in a beautiful way in the last thing. So I think it is that having the right framework where it's clear what you're going to say, ultimately you have to say what you said you were going to say.
Thank you very much, Jacques. I would like to give you the closing remarks on the inflation outlook, on communications, etc. You used to be governor of the Banque de France. You were managing director of the IMF. So share your thoughts about the future.
My observation is this one. The wave of disinflation that we have been through until 2021, this wave of disinflation was not produced, I'm sorry to say, by central banks. It was produced by globalization, by the openness of our markets to products that were incorporating less than 10% of the social and wage elements that we have in our so-called advanced countries. So the big factor behind disinflation was the openness of international markets. What do we see now? We see a movement of deglobalization. You see the United States are ready to enact other high tariffs. Now, high tariffs mean higher prices because you can't import the same things without a tax, which is the tariff. So that pushes the prices upward. The second element is the fight against immigration. The fight against immigration produces a tension on wages because you have less applicants in a way. And that will also produce higher prices. Now, these are structural elements that are difficult to fight with higher interest rates. And I am afraid that the level of inflation, 2%, is going to be well higher than that. If my analysis on deglobalization is correct. And so we have to be ready to live through a structural transformation, which is the consequences of deglobalization. It could very well be some models that are being working on, we are working on them. It may well be that inflation would move from the 2% target to 4 or 5% a year. Now, this is a very important question because it poses the question of how to fight against such a structural move. And I would like to leave you with this concerning preoccupation. Maybe I am exaggerating the dimension of those deglobalization consequences, but maybe I'm not. And we would have to figure out a method if this were to become true, because we can't live with 5% inflation every year. This would be a return to the 80s and with stagflation, because this is going to happen in the middle of an enormous fiscal crisis. We have to think that the fiscal crisis is not going to happen. It is happening. And what can monetary policy do in front of a structural change? It can raise interest rates, but this is going to complicate the fiscal position. So independence of central banks is a very nice notion. But when you hold 30 to 40% of the issuance of public debt at the central bank, I think it colors the notion of independence. Can you be totally independent when you hold a major part of the issuance of public bonds? I don't think you can. So I'm not providing you any solutions. I'm providing you a seed for thought. Things are going to happen on the structural side of deglobalization. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jacques, and thank you very much for the participants of the panel, and wish you a good journey back, or if you stay here for this evening for the reception. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Szapáry, and thank you to all the panelists. It was such an honor to have such a great expert, such a great group of experts with us today as the final panel of the 10th Lámfalussy Lectures Conference. As our conference is drawing to a close, I would like to thank all our speakers and participants for sharing their valuable insights, and of course our audience for staying with us throughout the program. Before we say goodbye, I would like to invite Mr. Barnabás Virág, Deputy Governor of the Magyar Nemzeti Bank, to deliver his closing remarks.
Okay, dear ladies and gentlemen, as it was mentioned, our conference is getting to the end. I want to say a special thanks to the last panel and to the panelists in the last panel, because I belong to the younger generation, so I do not have my own story with Sándor Lámfalussy. but for me it was very interesting to hear your own stories with Mr. Lamfalussy, because it's very clear for me that his talks are still very valid within the current very challenging environment. So some words about the conference. So I remember when our governor, György, arrived to the central bank in 2013, he said to me, okay, we need a flagship conference. We need a flagship conference with the name of Sándor Lamfalussy, and we started to think what can be the topic of the conference. Of course, a topic which is linked to the central banking. But of course, we realized that the economic world order started to change during that time. So we were 1 year after the very famous sentence of Mario Draghi. We were before the Russian troops occupied the Crimea. But it was easy to feel that big shifts started to materialize in the world economy. So that's why our vision was at that point, we need a conference, we need a platform where we can talk about those challenges we are facing in these years. And of course, we would like to invite the brightest brain to this conference to have a conversation about these topics. Of course, we do not have any expectation to look at those tectonic shifts we got in the 20s, but we started something on that point. So I think with the current conference, with the 10th edition of this Lamfalussy lecture, we reached a very important milestone that in that path. Of course, there are still many challenges surrounding us, but I think we got many very inspiring talks in the day. So of course, first of all, I would like to thank all of the panelists who participated in the day. I wrote 3+1 key takeaways for me about after the panels. For me, takeaway number 1, do not afraid to go back to basics. Within that, it's crucial to remain independent as a central bank, and we have to keep our eye on inflation. And of course, it's very important to find a proper coordination between the fiscal and monetary policy. Takeaway number 2, be resilient, also as an economy and also as institutions. Takeaway number 3, remain interconnected instead of too many fragmented decisions. And the +1, we need a peace. So we need a peace in Ukraine, we need a peace in Middle East, and we need a peace all over the world. For me, these were the key takeaways, but as I mentioned, there were many, many takeaways in the day. So I hope you enjoy the discussions. I hope you enjoy the city of Budapest. And of course, I hope you will return to the Lamfalussy lecture in the next year. Thank you very much for coming, and enjoy your time in Hungary. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Deputy Governor, for your excellent closing remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, with the closing remarks, our conference has come to an end. Let me thank our guests attending in person and following online. I hope you found great value in our professional program today. Have a lovely day. Goodbye.